The first time I realized something was wrong, it wasn't because he yelled. It was because he smiled. We were standing in our kitchen, the late afternoon light slanting in through the blinds, turning dust into something almost beautiful. I was telling him about my day, nothing dramatic, just a strange meeting at work where nobody wanted to take responsibility for a decision, so they talked in circles for an hour. I remember thinking I was being concise. I remember choosing my words carefully. Halfway through my sentence, Mark raised his hand. Not sharply, casually, like a conductor slowing an orchestra. "Can you stop for a second?" he said, smiling. I can't follow you when you do this." I laughed automatically. That reflex had already been trained into me. "Do what?" "This," he said, gesturing vaguely between us. "All the extra details. You don't need to narrate everything." The smile never left his face. That was the part that stayed with me. I apologized. I always did. Then I finished my story in 2 sentences instead of 10. He nodded approvingly, like I'd corrected a bad habit. At the time, I told myself this was normal. Couples adjust. People learn each other's rhythms. Love is compromise, right? What I didn't see then was that I was already shrinking. Mark and I had been together for 3.5 years. Married for 1. We met when I was loud in ways I didn't even recognize as loud, excited, curious, always connecting dots out loud. He said that was what drew him in. That I made the world feel less flat. Somewhere along the way, flat became preferable. It started with interruptions. Then corrections. Then jokes. "She gets carried away," he'd say to friends. "You know how she is," he'd add, rolling his eyes affectionately. "She means well, she just talks too much." Everyone laughed. Including me. I didn't want to be the person who made things awkward. I didn't want to be sensitive. I didn't want to prove him right. So I edited myself. I cut stories short. I paused to see if he was still listening. I stopped filling silences. When I spoke, I watched his face for signs of boredom the way people watch traffic lights. The night of his firm's charity mixer was the first time I noticed how exhausted I was. The venue was all glass and steel, expensive in that minimalist way that makes you feel underdressed no matter what you wear. I'd spent an hour getting ready, rehearsing neutral conversation topics in my head like flashcards. Work. Weather. Travel. Nothing personal. Nothing emotional. Mark was in a good mood. Confident. He always was in rooms like that. I was talking to one of his colleagues, a woman named Rachel, I think, about a project I'd been leading. She asked questions. She seemed genuinely interested. I relaxed a little. My sentences got longer. That's when Mark appeared beside me, his hand settling on my back. "She's very passionate," he said, laughing. "I'll give her that." Rachel smiled uncertainly. Mark leaned in closer. "She doesn't always realize when people are done listening." The words landed heavier than I expected. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just precise. My mouth opened. Closed. Something in me decided not to fight for the moment. I nodded politely and stepped back, letting Mark take over the conversation. He didn't even notice the transition. He just kept talking, confident and smooth, while I stood there holding my drink like a prop. I didn't speak again for the rest of the night. On the drive home, Mark turned the radio up and tapped the steering wheel along with the beat. "Nice evening," he said. "Low stress." I watched the city slide past the window and felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Not anger. Not sadness. Distance. The next morning, I woke up before him. The apartment was quiet in that early, fragile way. I made coffee and sat at the table, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. Mark's alarm went off in the bedroom. Normally, I'd nudge him. Remind him he had an early call. That his calendar was tight. I'd been doing that kind of thing for years without thinking about it. That morning, I stayed where I was. The alarm stopped. Silence returned. He woke up late. Panicked. Rushed. "Why didn't you wake me?" he asked, already irritated. I looked at him. "What?" he snapped. "What's that look supposed to mean?" I didn't answer. That was the first crack. Confusion flickered across his face, quickly replaced by annoyance. He muttered something under his breath and rushed out the door, still half-dressed. I went to work. Did my job. Spoke when required. Stayed quiet otherwise. When he came home that night, he was tense. "You've been weird all day," he said. I shrugged. "What is this?" he asked. "Are you mad about something?" I met his eyes and stayed silent. He laughed once, sharp and humorless. Okay. Very mature. But later that night, when I didn't respond to his questions, when I didn't fill the space the way I always had, his confidence started to fray. By the 3rd day, he was irritated. By the 4th, suspicious. By the 5th, angry. "This isn't normal," he said, pacing the living room. "You don't just stop talking." I kept folding laundry. "Say something," he demanded. I didn't. Silence, I learned, doesn't stay private for long. People noticed. His mother called, asking if I was feeling depressed. A coworker asked him if everything was okay at home. At a small dinner with friends, someone asked me directly if I was all right. I looked at them. Didn't answer. The room shifted. Mark laughed too loudly and said I was tired. No one seemed convinced. That night, he cornered me in the hallway. "You're making me look bad," he said. "People are starting to ask questions." I waited. His voice dropped. "Is this punishment?" I thought about that. About how small I'd made myself for so long. About how much effort it took to speak in ways that didn't irritate him. I shook my head. And for the first time, he looked afraid. Mark reacted the way people do when they lose control without realizing it yet. At first, he tried charm. He brought home takeout from my favorite place without asking. He played music softly while cooking dinner. He asked gentle questions, giving me space to answer, like he was demonstrating how reasonable he could be. I didn't respond. The charm curdled quickly. By the end of the week, he was talking at me instead of to me, narrating his day in exaggerated detail, waiting for me to jump in like I always used to. When I didn't, he filled the silence himself, growing louder, sharper, more frantic. "You know this is unhealthy, right?" he said one night. "This isn't how adults communicate." I folded towels. "This is emotional manipulation," he added. "You're stonewalling me." The word hung in the air, heavy with accusation. I wondered briefly how many times he'd read that somewhere, how carefully chosen it was. Then I wondered why it hadn't mattered when he'd been the one deciding when my voice was welcome. By Monday, the situation had started bleeding into his work. Mark worked in consulting, the kind of job where confidence mattered more than accuracy. He was good at it because he'd learned to speak smoothly, decisively, even when he didn't have all the answers. What people didn't see was how much of that confidence leaned on me, my reminders, my context, my quiet corrections before meetings. That Monday, he forgot a client call entirely. He came home furious, throwing his jacket onto the couch hard enough that it slid onto the floor. "They think I'm unreliable now," he said. "Do you understand that?" I met his gaze. "This is on you," he snapped. "You know that, right?" I didn't move. He stared at me like he was trying to provoke something physical, tears, anger, anything. When nothing came, he scoffed and stormed into the bedroom, slamming the door. That was the first night he slept facing away from me. The next twist came 2 days later, when his sister Lena showed up unannounced. She'd always been polite but distant with me. Cordial in the way family sometimes is when they don't quite know where to place you. She stood in the doorway, scanning the apartment like she was looking for signs of damage. "Mark said you're not talking," she said finally. I nodded once. Her eyes narrowed. "Why?" I didn't answer. She watched me for a long moment, then looked toward the hallway, lowering her voice. "Did he hurt you?" Something in my chest tightened. I shook my head. But I didn't reassure her either. That was enough. She left less than 10 minutes later. When Mark came home and realized she'd been there, his reaction was explosive. "What did you tell her?" he demanded. I stayed quiet. "You're turning my family against me," he shouted. "You're sick." That night, he blocked the doorway when I tried to go to bed. "Just talk," he said, voice cracking. "Please." I waited. Eventually, he stepped aside. But something had shifted. The air felt brittle now, like one wrong move would shatter it. By the weekend, people outside our marriage were actively involved. His mother called again. This time crying. Saying she was worried. Saying Mark sounded unlike himself. A neighbor knocked on our door after hearing raised voices, asking if everything was okay. Mark started explaining me to everyone. "She's stressed. She's going through something. She's always been sensitive." The stories kept changing. None of them matched what people were seeing. At a small dinner party with mutual friends, someone asked me directly, "Are you safe?" Mark laughed too loudly. "Of course she is." I looked at the table. Stayed silent. No one laughed with him. The next day, he was called into HR. He came home pale, pacing. "They asked if there was trouble at home," he said. "They asked if you were okay." For the first time, I saw real fear on his face. "This has gone too far," he said. "You don't get to ruin my life over some misunderstanding." That night, he grabbed my arm. It happened fast. Instinctive. His fingers closed around my wrist as I turned away from him. It hurt. Not enough to scream. Enough to register. He released me immediately, like he hadn't meant to do it. Like he was surprised by himself. "I didn't," he started. I looked at him. Something in his expression changed. He backed away. Neither of us slept that night. The following days blurred together. Missed deadlines. Awkward silences. Growing suspicion from people who had once taken his confidence at face value. Then came the email. An anonymous report had been filed at his company expressing concern about his behavior and mine. It mentioned emotional distress, isolation, volatility at home. Mark was placed on temporary leave pending review. He blamed me instantly. "You planned this," he said. "You wanted this." I packed a bag that night. Not to leave. Not yet. Just in case. The breaking point came in the storage room 3 days later. He followed me down there, shouting, demanding explanations, pacing too close. The shelves were old, overloaded with boxes from previous tenants, paint cans, tools, things we'd never sorted through. He slammed his hand against the wall. The shelf shuddered. I stepped back. The crash was sudden and violent. Metal screaming against concrete. Boxes exploding open. A sharp, wet sound as Mark hit the floor. Blood. Everything became noise again. Neighbors. Sirens. Voices asking questions. I answered only what was required. At the hospital, a police officer asked if Mark had touched me earlier that night. I showed him my wrist. The rest unfolded without drama. Which was somehow worse. Hospitals have a way of flattening time. Everything feels suspended there, decisions, emotions, even identities. You become a version of yourself defined by forms and waiting rooms and the plastic smell of disinfectant. I sat in one of those molded chairs for hours, my hands folded in my lap, watching people come and go while Mark lay behind a curtain somewhere down the hall. I hadn't spoken since the paramedics arrived. They asked questions. I nodded when I needed to. Shook my head when I didn't. One of them kept glancing at me with concern, her eyes lingering on my arm. The police officer introduced himself quietly. Officer Daniel Ruiz. He asked if we could talk somewhere private. We stood near the vending machines while he asked what had happened in the storage room. I answered in short sentences. Facts only. No interpretation. Old shelf. Boxes fell. Mark was standing too close. He asked if Mark had been yelling. Yes. He asked if Mark had touched me earlier. I hesitated for half a second, then rolled up my sleeve. The bruise had already darkened, blooming in shades of blue and purple like a bruise always does when it knows it's been seen. Officer Ruiz didn't react. He just nodded and wrote something down. When Mark's sister arrived, everything changed. Lena burst through the emergency room doors with her phone already in her hand, her face tight with panic. She saw me first. What did you do? She demanded, loud enough that people turned to look. I didn't answer. She laughed once, sharp and disbelieving. Of course. You won't even defend yourself. Security approached. The officer stepped closer. Lena started shouting then, about how I'd always been off, how Mark had bent over backwards for me, how this was all part of some twisted plan. Her voice echoed off the tile walls, drawing more attention with every word. Officer Ruiz watched her carefully. Took notes. When Mark was brought out briefly on a gurney, his head wrapped in gauze, he saw me and started yelling. She did this, he said, pointing. She set me up. The nurse told him to calm down. He didn't. I stood there, silent, while he unraveled in front of everyone. Later, Ruiz told me Mark had a concussion. 12 stitches. Overnight observation. Do you feel safe going home? He asked. That was the first question that mattered. I shook my head. He nodded like he'd expected that answer. I left the hospital before Mark was discharged. Lena shouted something after me, but I didn't hear what it was. I was already walking toward the parking lot, my legs moving on instinct. I didn't go home. I went to Maya's. She opened the door in sweatpants and an old college hoodie, took one look at my face, and stepped aside without asking a single question. She handed me a glass of water and let me sit on her couch in silence while her cat climbed into my lap. That night, my phone filled with messages. Mark swung wildly between rage and desperation. You ruined me. Answer me. This isn't funny anymore. Please just talk to me. I didn't mean to grab you. You're sick. I didn't respond. I took screenshots. Everyone. The next morning, Officer Ruiz called. The incident in the storage room had been classified as a workplace-level accident, unsafe shelving, no permits, long-standing hazard. No criminal intent. But he asked again about my arm. About Mark blocking doorways. About yelling. About how long this had been happening. I told him I'd need time to think. He said he understood. Gave me his direct number anyway. By the afternoon, the story had already shifted. Mark's company placed him on administrative leave pending an internal review. HR wanted my statement. Mark's mother left 3 voicemails, each one more emotional than the last. In the third, she said, I don't understand what's happening, but he needs you. Please. I saved the voicemail. Didn't respond. 2 days later, Maya sat across from me at her kitchen table, watching me scroll through messages. Are you doing this to punish him? She asked gently, or because you're scared? The question landed heavier than I expected. I opened my mouth to answer and realized I didn't know. What had started as self-preservation had taken on a life of its own. The silence wasn't just protection anymore. It was exposure. That afternoon, Mark's coworker Jenna showed up at Maya's apartment. She stood in the doorway, visibly nervous, hands clasped together. I'm sorry to bother you, she said, glancing behind her like Mark might appear. I wanted to check on you. She talked for 10 minutes straight. Asked if Mark had hurt me. Asked if I needed help. Asked if I could blink twice if I was in danger. I didn't respond. She left pale and shaken. The next day, HR contacted Mark about concerns of domestic instability and workplace safety. Mandatory counseling was mentioned. So was suspension. Mark exploded. He left me 47 messages in one night. Threats. Apologies. Accusations. One message stood out. You think you're winning, but everyone knows what you are. That was the one Officer Ruiz paid special attention to. He suggested I consider a temporary protective order. It's about patterns, he said. And this is one. I started writing everything down that night. A timeline. Dates. Exact phrases Mark had used over the years. Seeing it laid out made something click into place. This wasn't sudden. It was cumulative. The next twist came from an unexpected place. A woman from my old book club sent me screenshots of a group chat I'd never been part of. It was Mark and several of his friends. The messages went back months. She never shuts up. Sometimes I fantasize about just walking away mid-sentence. I swear one day I'm going to snap. One message, dated weeks before the charity mixer, stopped me cold. I'll shut her up eventually. The others had reacted with laughing emojis. I forwarded everything to Officer Ruiz. The silence wasn't hiding anything anymore. It was documenting it. The protective order was granted on a Tuesday morning that felt strangely ordinary. I sat in a small courtroom with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead while a judge skimmed through printed screenshots of my life. Messages. Dates. Words that had once sounded harmless when spoken aloud but looked different in ink. Mark wasn't there. His lawyer was. I answered questions with my voice for the first time in weeks. It felt foreign. Hoarse. Like using a muscle that had atrophied. The judge didn't look at me much. She didn't need to. The evidence spoke with brutal clarity. When it was over, I walked outside into sunlight that felt too bright, too forgiving. Mark violated the order 3 days later. Not directly. Indirectly. He sent his mother. She showed up at Maya's apartment with groceries and tears and the weight of a lifetime of excuses. He's not well, she said. You know that. He needs help. I looked at her. He always loved you, she continued. You're just misunderstanding each other. I closed the door gently. Called Officer Ruiz. That was the moment the narrative changed for good. The violation was logged. So were the voicemails she'd left me at his request. Patterns matter. Mark's company terminated him a week later. The internal review cited conduct inconsistent with company values and credible concerns regarding emotional instability. He spiraled. He posted vague messages online about betrayal and injustice. Friends unfollowed quietly. Some reached out to me privately with apologies. One sent a message that stayed with me. I didn't laugh because it wasn't funny. I just didn't know what to say. The criminal case never went forward. There wasn't enough for that. But the civil one did. During mediation, Mark finally saw me across a table again. He looked smaller. Thinner. His confidence stripped down to something brittle. You destroyed everything, he said quietly, like a confession. I didn't respond. For a moment, I saw the man I'd loved. The one who'd once said I made the world feel less flat. Then I saw the one who needed silence to survive. The settlement was clean. No contact. No admissions. No closure disguised as forgiveness. I moved out of state 2 months later. New job. New apartment. New routines. The quiet didn't scare me anymore. Sometimes I talk too much again. Sometimes I stop mid-sentence and remember the kitchen light slanting through the blinds, the smile that came before everything else. And sometimes I realize the silence was never the absence of my voice. It was the sound of someone else losing control.